Hello, ladies and gents. Welcome to the third episode of the CDN series, where we are going to talk about AWS CloudFront, which is the CDN that is provided by AWS. If you haven't watched already, there are two other episodes before this. One which talks about the basics of what a CDN is, and the second one talks about how to set up a CDN endpoint in Microsoft Azure. So without much delay, let's jump on to our AWS console, developer console, and see how we can get started with creating a CDN endpoint. So once you, so I'll actually go back to the starting point of where you would land when you go into the AWS management console. Inside the AWS management console, if you want to set up a CDN, you can just select the CDN in the services, and then it will just show you CloudFront, the global content delivery network. Once you click on it, it will take you to the CDN dashboard. Over here, when you start off, you wouldn't actually see any of the endpoints. I've just created this endpoint before the demo to basically give you the end the end state of the CDN, as it takes time to kind of provision that endpoint. So once you click on this create distribution button, you'll see two options here. One is web and the other one is RTMP. We would actually just demo the website, and the RTMP is for real-time processing, which is basically for video and audio streaming primarily. So once you get started, you see a lot of options there. I'm actually going to talk about most of these options. But just before I start talking about these options, as you notice, there is a question mark right on the top right side, which will take you to the detailed documentation. And there is an information icon next to each field, which is going to give you an understanding of what this field is or field or property is all about. So as you notice, there are also section headings over here. So this one talks about origin settings, and if you've had a look at my previous videos, and I'll just jump back to the slide for this one. This is how a client interacts with a CDN, and that interacts with the server. So when we talk about the origin settings, we are actually talking about this this section here, where the CDN actually interacts with the origin server and gets that information back. So in order to get this working, obviously you need to have your assets set up somewhere. I've actually set up my asset in blob storage in Azure. And this you could have it in in your own domain, or you can have it hosted on Amazon S3 buckets, or any custom IP address as well. So if I were to show you my the asset that I've hosted, this is the blob storage asset that I've hosted, and my URL looks something like this. So this is my base URL, right? So my this image that I've just shown is actually hosted in the blob storage in a container, right? So what I'm going to do is copy this URL and go back to my AWS console and paste it over here, right? So this is my this is my base URL, and this is what it does. It basically just strips out the origin path and just filters everything based on the original URL. So again, it's actually filtered out my base URL and the origin path. If you notice on this will again give you some detail about what your host path can be, and with some caveats around if it's an S3 bucket. Then your origin path, if you don't have your asset hosted directly on the root, if you don't have your asset directly on the route that you've specified, then you're able to actually give an origin path over here as well. You don't need to worry about the origin ID. It just replicates whatever you've got in the origin domain name, and it basically gets passed along in the header values. Now coming to the minimum origin SSL protocol. This is a security protocol. Generally, most of the web browsers that clients or web browsers currently use TLS v1 as of December 2019, and that can change as you move along, right? So you've got a lot of the newer clients are actually on an experimental version of TLS version 1.3, but the easiest way to check your server's TLS version is to just use any online utility. One particular utility that I like is a website that's called SSL Labs. So if you go to SSL Labs, just key in your server IP address or domain name, and then it will just basically set up some handshakes and assess what TLS version your server is at. So we are specifically talking about the origin server. So you need to select what the highest origin what SSL protocol your origin server supports. So basically, we'll at this point in time we'll just leave it as default. Then you move along to the origin protocol policy. So HTTP only, HTTPS only. These two options are pretty self-explanatory. The one that stands out is the match viewer. So if you select this option, what it does is it actually matches what your viewer actually requests. So when we talk about viewer, it means what your client's actually asking for. So if your client goes to your website with HTTP, HTTP www.example.com, then it will just match that viewer and then make an HTTP call instead of an HTTPS one. And if your client makes an HTTPS call, then it will use HTTPS. So again, we'll just select the match viewer one because that's probably the easiest one to set up. Then you've got the origin response timeout. Again, we leave all of these values as default, but the origin response timeout actually stands for how long would it actually try to wait for a response from the origin server, and when should it time out. You can actually increase this time, decrease it, but better to keep it default. So if we have set up a match viewer by default, then we would actually have to either set both of these ports ourselves or just leave them as default. If you've got just HTTP or HTTPS, then you've got to set the relevant ports in that case. The next section is the origin custom headers. Again, you can have as many headers as you like. You see the right add button over here. You can just go in and maybe add the CORS headers that will allow the CDN to serve assets across different domains. And you can add other cookie headers, for example, and all of those headers are taken into account. Now the next setting over here, next heading that you see is the default cache behavior settings. Now if I go back to the slides again, this was the earlier heading, and now we are actually talking about this side, right? The client and the CDN aspect. So by default, the path pattern is default, so you don't need to change that. The viewer protocol policy, HTTP and HTTPS, you can have both of them. Generally, again, this basically allows the viewer to access your CDN content via HTTP or HTTPS, right? You can select redirect HTTP to HTTPS. So whenever someone makes a call to your HTTP version of your URL, then it'll automatically just try to fetch it from HTTPS and just redirect the request. And then you're always free to use the HTTPS only version, right? Now when you look, the third part of this is the allowed HTTP methods. The first method is pretty self-explanatory. By default, that's what people generally use when they are setting up a CDN. That's the get and the head, right? Because all you generally want from a CDN is to extract resources rather than make any changes to the resource. The third option is interesting because you've got put, post, patch, and delete. Now, apart from the get and the head options, the put, post, patch, and delete are actually going to make changes or are supposed to make changes to your underlying resources. So that then you get the question, right, that when you're making these requests, how do you expect the CDN to cache that information? Because you don't really want CDN to be caching any information that's supposed to make changes to your resources, right? And that's something that can be confusing. But if it's easy to understand that you've got apart from this allowed HTTP methods, you've also got a cached HTTP methods. So in terms of implementing the caching, only two methods all get implemented, and those are the get and the head method, right? What this option means is that you can actually make a request to the CDN for a particular resource and ask it to maybe post a resource, right? But what the CDN would actually do is act as a proxy rather than caching anything. So for the purposes of caching, it's only going to cache get and head resources. Now there are three options that are very similar in how they behave. One option is cache based on selected request headers. The second linked option is forward cookies, and the third one is query string forwarding and caching. Now all these three options behave in a very similar manner. If I open up the drop down, they've got pretty similar options as well. The default one is none, right? So that basically means it ignores all the headers in the request that's originating from the client. It ignores all the headers and just returns every piece of request that is basically returns it as a separate request, and that request doesn't tie in with any of the headers, right? And if I pop open the forward cookies, it's got almost if not exactly the same options as the first one, and the third one has the sentences are slightly different, but again pretty similar. So what does this mean, right? So if you've got this is basically a capability to allow you to base your caching mechanism based on your headers, right? So let's say if I were to say that if I had a custom header which was something to do with the language of the viewer, right? So let's just call it language viewer, and based on this, I had maybe two options in there. I could probably say AU for Australia, or I could say this can have a possible option of EN for English. Based on this, what's going to happen is if a request comes in that is asking for a resource called www.example.com/cars. So basically, I'm asking for getting all possible cars in the system, right? If I had this original URL, let's say with this header, this request header, the CDN would actually pull all the cars using this header, and then cache that separately, and then it will make another call if the user actually requests another call from a different with a different header, and it will cache that response separately as well. So against each of these headers for the very same URL, you'll actually get two different responses that would be cached. And how do you actually do that? So the first one actually removes all headers, right? So it doesn't take any headers into account. But when you select whitelist, you actually get given a set of options. So you can say just like I was saying, CloudFront viewer country, maybe add that, and it will just add based on this request header. If there are like 10 different options, it will have 10 different responses for the very same URL. And with the same thing, you can actually select all. So when you've got all, it doesn't really cache anything. It'll just it'll again act as a proxy and push all the requests to the CDN. So this might make sense in certain scenarios, but that would be very, very rare, right? So I'll keep this to none. Now this object caching is another interesting one. So the object caching mechanism would allow you to configure how long would you want the CDN to cache your resources. So let's say, going back to the earlier example, if I want my car's API, my car response to be held for 2 days, right? I can configure that time in the default time to live. So, but what this will mean is that for all my requests, that's going to be the case, and I wouldn't be able to modify that without modifying this endpoint in the CDN. However, you've got an option of not controlling your caching capability from the console. Instead, you can actually go in and select this option. Now, what this option would allow you to do is there are, I'll jump back to my slides, but there are three cache control headers that requests can actually use, that responses can actually provide, right? The cache control headers are max age, max age, and expires. Now, in combination, these three headers allow you to provide some information to the browser to to basically indicate how long do you think the information returned should be cached. If you think it should be cached for 2 days, that's what you give in max age, and that's what you give simple date and expires, right? And then it's the browser's job to actually handle that. But the CDN can actually tap into these response headers and can then expire the information that's got, or it makes another call to get some fresh data out of your origin server. So again, for this demo, I'll just keep it as default. Now coming to the forward cookies, as we've spoken about it earlier, you've got the option of keeping it to default, or you can whitelist it, or you can again say all. Again, we'll just keep this one whitelisted as well, and the same goes for query string forwarding and caching. So basically, you can just select your query strings. If you've got something like, let's say you've got multiple query strings. Again, coming back to this cars example, I'd say if I've got a query string as query is equal to test, and I've got query 2 equals test2. So as you can see, I've got two different options in my query strings, right? So what I can do is basically I can say I can copy both of these, and I can whitelist based on these. So I can say, and remember, you've got to do this in separate lines. So each query string has to be on a separate line. So I can say that I need to basically cache the response based on these query strings separately. And then what will happen is when it makes a request, it will just have two different options for those responses. So again, I'll just remove this, and I'll basically select none. This option for smooth streaming, we generally wouldn't use it, and this is reserved for audio and video streaming. The option for restrict viewer access, you can do that. You can select this if you've got some private information that you don't want the CDN to serve for every request that comes in, but again, it requires some additional configuration in AWS. Compress objects automatically. This deals with how your objects get compressed when they are residing in the CDN. So if I come back to my diagram again, so what happens is if your CDN makes a call from to the origin server, the request comes back from the origin server and gets stored in the CDN. Now the CDN has got the option of actually compressing that information or those files. Let's say they might be JS files or images, right? So it's got an option of compressing those files and then sending a compressed version to the client. How exactly does it know if the client actually accepts a compressed version of a particular asset? The client sends that information as encoding type when it makes an initial handshake. So when the initial connection is established between the client and the CDN knows which versions, which assets it can render, it can provide in a compressed form, and that helps massively. According to some research done by a few CDN companies, it can actually reduce your bandwidth by about 70%. So that's a lot of saving. So coming back to this options again, these are some really good options. This is something that I didn't really see in Azure, and I think it's really interesting, is how you can actually tap into the serverless world with Lambda function associations. You've got some predefined options, so and they are basically like, basically types of events. So you can actually attach a serverless function and do your own thing based on a certain event, and you're not restricted to one event. You can actually add a lot of different events and basically do additional functionality based on these event types. So serverless are out of scope for this demo at this point in time, but I'll do another video to show how we can create serverless functions. So I thought this was a really neat feature. So coming to this this section, this talks about distribution settings. If you look at the price class, again, depending on what kind of replication you want for this CDN, you've got a few options. I'll just select use all edge locations for the best for performance. But let's say you're serving your clients only in the US, Canada, and Europe. You might not want all the locations in this option, because the more locations you've got, obviously the more AWS is going to charge you for it. Then you've got an option of providing your own CNAMEs as well, because by default what happens is when you create an endpoint, CloudFront is going to give you a very weird looking endpoint, something like the highlighted area over here, right? So random number, digits, and then CloudFront.net. And if you want to change that part, then you can provide alternate domain names, and then you can set up a certificate as well. If you want to set up a certificate, you need to click this option, and it takes you through a configuration wizard where you can you'll have to validate whether you own a domain. So if I were to type in www.example.com, because my intention is to pass use something like www.example.com assets.js as my base domain name, then I'll have to at least validate my domain name for this to work. So if you scroll down to the bottom, again, supported HTTP versions. By default, HTTP2 is selected. That's faster, better. So better to leave it at that. The final bit of option that I'm going to talk about is the default root option. So generally what happens is if someone hits your endpoint, and that endpoint is without the asset name that you're serving, then CloudFront gives you a very weird looking error telling you that that asset doesn't really exist. So if I were to, for example, if I were to look at caching, cache my JS file, right? My URL would look like this. So I'm trying to cache my assets.js. But what happens if someone actually goes to example.com and tries to fetch that? And then what is going to happen is that they're going to see a weird looking error from CloudFront. So what you can actually do here is basically just use a default file, index.js, for example, right? And then you can just use that file to that file would just display by itself when you've got when the asset name isn't provided at the end of the distribution list. So with that, I think we've got everything covered to set up our CDN. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move myself out of the way, and I'm going to create this distribution. and it gives me an error. It says I've got, so the error over here, the parameter CNAME contains one or more parameters. So I've apparent so I didn't, so if you see, I forgot to remove this CNAME, and I can't actually just key that in without doing any sort of validation. So I'll just go in and remove that again and try creating the distribution again. So this time, as you see, this is getting deployed. Now it usually takes around 5 to 10 minutes to get this set up. So what I've got is I've got a very similar endpoint setup already. If I go in, it's got the same default settings that I had, and I can look at additional capabilities. I've got different origins as well. I can look at different behaviors over here. So if I go in and try to look at so this is my origin ID, right? And what I'm trying to look for is my URL. So if I go back to this grid again, as you'll see, I've got this domain name. The new one is being generated using this domain name, and I've got this domain name, right? So what I'm going to do is copy this domain name, and I'm going to paste it on a separate tab, on a new tab. And as you can see, this renders out my default blob. It's exactly the same, and it's exactly the same endpoint as being deployed just right now. And just because it takes a bit more time, I've just set it up. So with that, I think we've come to the end of this episode. In the next episode, I'll be looking at looking at some of the other CDNs, and then feel free to follow me on YouTube and subscribe to my channel for the latest updates. And if you've got any comments, feel free to leave those comments in the comment box as well, and I'll try my best to respond. With things like with all the resources on the cloud, they tend to change massively. So if there are any updates, I'll try to do my best to keep the videos updated, so we don't lose out on any of the new features that are coming in. So take care of yourselves until I see you next time again. Thank you.